Because I have a couple of friends who'd like to have heard Larry's words of wisdom.
Yeah, I'm not hearing you too well yet. You need to hold it to your mouth. Okay.
You want it louder?
All right. I will introduce you now. I think it's ready. Okay. Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Let's go to England and maybe to upstate New York. Shall we do that today? And I want to talk about nationalism with two old friends of mine. Both of them are longtime peace historians and peace researchers and people teaching in peace studies at universities. One of them, Nigel Young, is now in England. He's a retired professor from Cornell University, or rather, not Cornell, Colgate University, where he was a peace studies professor for many years. And since then, he has published a number of things, including an encyclopedia about peace and a book about nationalism. So we will talk about nationalism today. And in upstate New York, we have Larry Whitner. Lawrence Whitner is a professor from the University of New York at, is it Syracuse or Rochester, Larry?
Albany.
Albany. Well, by process and elimination, I would have got there eventually. Okay, very good. I was waffling, trying to get through by saying upstate New York, but that won't do when it comes to explaining which university campus you're at. So very good. It's good to see both of you. Hello, Nigel. Say hi to everybody.
Hello, everybody.
Okay.
Surprisingly warm Yorkshire.
Yorkshire, yes. Okay. Okay. Well, now I think it's the other day when I don't know what I was reading, but I came across something that Larry had published, claiming that the recent elections, especially I guess in Europe, but maybe elsewhere, suggests that possibly the right-wing nationalist tendencies that we've been seeing for the past few years may be waning, and that maybe we're coming out of this period of nationalism. And I don't know whether I'm representing your views correctly or not, Larry, but would you start off by telling us what you think is going on as evidenced by not just polls, but anything else, especially elections lately?
Yes, well, as we know, there was a major nationalist upsurge in the middle of the last decade, and people like Donald Trump rose to power. There was a rise of European right-wing nationalist parties, the Alternative for Germany, Marine Le Pen's National Front, UKIP in the United Kingdom, and they made very substantial gains. Furthermore, there were longer-term nationalists such as Narendra Modi in India, and other figures whose and Jair Bolsonaro's victory in Brazil and so on, all of which seemed to portend a nationalist tide that was sweeping over the world. And in some ways it did so. But I also suggest that there was a regression of this tide starting around 2019. Trump, of course, lost the election in 2020. Bolsonaro seems on his last legs. The successor to Le Pen's National Front, the National Rally Party, lost badly in the regional elections.
Excuse me.
Not a single.
You say the successor to Le Pen? It has Marina Le Pen is
her party.
Oh.
Yeah, she changed the name of the National Front, which was associated with fascist movements of the past, to the National Rally Party. But it was the same party, basically. and she lost badly in those regional elections. Modi's been losing um, elections in various Indian states. In Turkey, Erdogan has lost the big cities. So there does seem to be a shift, not a total collapse of the nationalist movement, which continues to hold power in a number of countries and to be perhaps on the verge of retaking power in the United States. But nonetheless, there seems to have been a turning of the tide in many countries.
Well, that's an encouraging thought. I don't know whether, I haven't looked at things closely enough to take heart yet, but especially since it looks to me as if Trump is still extremely influential in the U.S. and could get even elected, especially as they're tinkering with the voting system so as to stack things in favor of the Republicans next time. I wouldn't. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think he's completely out of the picture, or do you think there's a chance he could come back in?
Oh, there's certainly a chance he can come back in, and indeed, we're going to have midterm elections next year, and the Republicans may retake Congress, which of course would be a victory for this kind of right-wing nationalism that's been so influential in the recent past.
Yeah, as I watch the nightly news every day, I think, oh my goodness, there's very little. I haven't felt the kind of hopefulness that you've expressed, and yet, of course, we have to be hopeful. So, Nigel, let's turn to your work. You have a book out that I haven't discussed, and in fact, I haven't read yet. But
Larry has.
Yes.
You can tell us about your book and what is it it appeared just at the right moment in history when there was this upsurge in nationalism. So what is it you had to say in that book?
Well, first of all, it appeared 10 years later than I would have liked it to have done, but that's another story. Got tied up with a thing called the encyclopedia, as you know, so got rather delayed. I planned to do this when I was stopping teaching at Colgate, actually, back in 2000, and then we had the 9/11 and the follow-up, so that also is rather not my project off. Anyway, finally I finished it, yes. But actually I would really like to take up the issues that Larry's raised, because I think that would make for an interesting conversation, and for all three of us, really. And that is, how we look at what's happening in nationalism, because of being here in Britain with Brexit and Boris and all the rest of it, I think it looks rather different. What I think I would look at it is not a either or. I think it's a question of, to use sort of science jargon, centrifugal or centripetal. And I think what's happening is, and of course it happened in Germany in the 30s and before, is polarization. In other words, the forces of nationalism are still, you only have to look at the Republican Party in America, are alive and kicking, very much so, and anti-ethnic feeling, and America first is not gone away by any means, and nor has Britain first or England first. And that's when it gets interesting, I think, when you say, well, what unit are we talking about? The other sort of caveat for me would be I still bother about the left-right language that we use, because is nationalism left or right? If it's right, then the Viet Cong were nationalists, presumably, and therefore they're of the right. But no, I mean, that's not how most people would see it. They would see them as socialist, communist, whatever. So you've got a left nationalism and you've got a right nationalism, so that muddles things up for a bit. And so I think that, first of all, that binary left-right thing is problematic. I also think that underfreighted views of nationalism. Because I live in a country in which there are 4 very strong nationalisms, or maybe even you could say 5, an up-and-coming Yorkshire and Cornish nationalism as well. And of those, it's interesting that only one of those nationalisms was against Europe. So the other 3 active nationalism, Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, were all Wales very close, but nevertheless, certainly Scotland very clearly, 70% staying in Europe, Ireland more, even, and certainly that has raised the issue of possible reunification of the north and south of Ireland. But also there is a Northern Ireland identity which is beginning to stand up against London. The dominance of London is a big issue, a political issue, and so you then get that, again, centrifugal, centripetal, you get Yorkshire National Party candidates getting significant number of votes, outvoting the Greens, sadly, in some ways. You get Cornish nationalism on the rise again, linking up with the Bretons and other, nationalist groups in France. So what is nationalism? If we look at Spain, for example, 50% for independence for Catalonia. In the past, it's been over that for the Basques, and there are other decentralist movements in Spain as well. And Catalonia traditionally left and socialist, but with this nationalist tide going more to the right. Madrid wanting to hang on to Catalonia and the Basque nation has gone on the whole to the left with Podemos. There's a bit of a wiggle there, but on the whole, if you want to use that left-right language, which is the best we have in some ways, but it's so often misleading. Going back to my, political sociology 101 or whatever it was, that was always something I tried to discuss with students because they had their own nationalisms. Some of the hockey players were from Quebec and some were from Toronto. So there was a bit of nationalism going 200 miles up the road in Canada, and it wasn't Canadian nationalism necessarily, which is something that does unite people in some ways, particularly because of the terrible losses in World War I and the Poppy and John McCrae and all that stuff, which was what my book was about. Really, was about what is the memory of the nation and how far do these great traumas of the Holocaust and war, nuclear weapons, bring people beyond the nation through the memories of Hiroshima or Auschwitz or Passchendaele. So so that's just a little bit about my book. But anyway, my argument is that nationalism is both growing and dissipating, and that within a society you can see a lot of different nationalisms, very often obviously competing with each other. Spanish nationalism with Catalonian nationalism. Scottish nationalism, so far that it looks really quite likely that Scotland will become an independent nation and will seek to be as close to Europe as possible, although there are lots of constitutional problems with that. And it might, again, lies with Ireland, mean a closed border. And I think, the one thing that the Scottish nationalists have to promise the electorate, because they're way ahead in the polls, and Labour lost almost all their seats in Scotland, not least because they've tended to be something of a English nationalist Labour Party. So you've got this tension whereby these elements are in collision course politically. It's really quite dramatic. I think people only wake up when it happens, and actually the disunited Queendom isn't united at all. It's in pieces. 5, and maybe then reduced to 4 if there was a border poll in the north of Ireland and the north decided to get where it makes economic sense to get back with Dublin and have one trading area in Ireland and not be stopped for sending its sausages or bringing sausage, which is one of the things, a big crisis in European diplomacy at the bottom as to whether sausages can travel between England and Ireland because of Brexit and so on. So I don't think a lot of people realise that Brexit was driven by English nationalism. English nationalism, not Scottish nationalism, not Welsh nationalism, not Irish nationalism, certainly, because Ireland has done marvellously out of Europe. It's really been a leveller up. And so you have to see that these are units, just as in long-standing Walloon Flemish conflict in Flanders and in Belgium, with one half of the country speaking Dutch and the other half speaking French, or version of, And again, with Larry talking about Le Pen, you know, very much she had a regional basis and so on. Yes, she did badly. But why? Why did she do badly? Why did Nigel Farage and the Brexiteers fade from the scene as a political party in their own right? Well, I think I can tell you, and I think most political commentators here would say the same. Because both the Conservatives and the Labour Party moved towards the vote which Farage and the Brexit people have got. And so therefore they became little Englanders, they became strong on immigration, not taking Syrian refugees. They cut the international aid budget. Britain had one of the best international aid budgets in any country. That's been zilched almost. Terrible cuts to wonderful charities in Africa and Asia. And so this is a kind of a virulent English nationalism, but which has infected both the major parties. So, you know, 80%, in other words, would be voting in an election at least for parties that have become Little England parties, anti-Europe, anti-immigrant. They've stolen the clothes from the far right. And that happens. How far that's true of Le Pen and Macron, I'm not sure, because I don't follow Brexit politics very closely. So Larry, you know, may be able to correct me on that. But my sense is possibly the French nationalism of Macron is always a little bit different. But nevertheless, it's a French nationalism. It's been there for a very long time. That's why they've got out of NATO, and so had a very changed relationship with NATO. So there you've got it all over Europe. You know, Catalans and Basques. You've got the League in Italy, and so it's not a very clear picture. My interest is not so much in nationalism versus nationalism, Croat versus Serb versus whatever, Slovene and Czech, or rather Slovak and Czech, or Polish, nationalism, or all the republics of Russia, which have their own nationalism. At the same time, Russia becomes more nationalist under Putin. Yeah, so you know, you've got this sort of very mixed picture, very fluid, and people using the nationalist thing for a while, and then maybe later a more internationalist one. But the tragedy for England was that we had a wonderful socialist leader, Jeremy Corbyn, who was a true internationalist, and with a wonderful, really socialist program.
Nigel, excuse me a second. My assistant Adam has joined us, and
welcome, Adam. We're having
actually just Dr. Young. If you could talk louder and clearer, or closer to the microphone, the people listening can't hear you very clearly. The audio is fading in and out.
But is there any way that I think it may be just a broadband problem here, because we're out in the country. And we're supposed to have fiber optic, but I'm not sure that it really worked very well. So can you tell me, is the problem the internet connection? Or
no, it's just the audio is very, very quiet. Perhaps if there's a way you could get closer to the microphone?
Well, I've got it in my mouth.
Well, you're very clear now, but that may not be the best solution to have it directly in your mouth. But it's just several people are having difficulty hearing you.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm having a dialogue. Larry, tell me what should I speak slower? Break up?
No. The problem is your distance from the mic, and if you don't have to have it right up to your mouth, but you do have to have it fairly close to your mouth and keep it there. You're moving your head and body around away from the mic.
Can I do a check?
The sound.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're fine now.
Now, if I go here, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Here?
Not quite as well.
Well, it looks like about here then, so I'll keep rigid. Rigid as a pile of books.
Good.
My apologies for interrupting. I just wanted to let you know that people were having issues hearing, but it seems to be a bit clearer, or a lot clearer now. Thank you.
Okay, good. Right.
Okay, thank you.
I think I should let Larry come back at me now.
Oh, all right. Well,
Yeah.
I missed, as I think some of the audience did, some of what you were saying, but I'd like to pick up on this point of the ubiquity of nationalism in Britain and around the world. That is, different kinds of nationalism, whether those That's Scottish nationalism or Welsh nationalism, and or Irish nationalism, and so on. The contrast I was drawing was between globalist thinking,
Yes.
as personified by support of the United Nations, of the World Health Organization, or the Paris Climate Accords, and so on the one hand, and on the other hand, the nationalist movements that had developed on the basis of traditional nation states like Britain, like France, like the United States, and so on. I'll admit you're perfectly correct that within them there are either regional or ethnic or other divisions that are very significant. But what I was saying was that the conflict between the nation state and world citizenship and globalist thinking, on the other hand, had seemed to go in favor of the nationalists for a time, but it seems to have reversed itself somewhat in the last few years, when the nationalists had begun to lose elections, and their gains in other countries such as Germany or the Netherlands and so on had stopped. And while they were in place now as political parties, they were not on the verge of taking power any longer.
Right. No, that's right. I mean, I think the extreme right has been pushed back in many places. Not everywhere, unfortunately. Don't see it really going back far enough in Turkey, for example, or Hungary, where they're pretty scary a lot of the time. But yeah, no, I think you're right at that kind of micro level. And I'm also into the longer term trends. That's why my book is about a century of building alternative, more globalist memory. So I'm very much, so that's very much on the same wavelength there. What I would ask you is what political forces are carrying that dream of a more global, more cosmopolitan, more universalist society. I mean, obviously Biden seems to be, heading in better directions. The Greens also have a program, which, is almost, quintessentially universalistic, because it's about global survival. But where else do you see that? You see, because I don't see. That's why I became such a very strong, supporter of Corbyn and John McDowell, because I think they were truly internationalist, and they cared about the Palestinians, and they cared about all the issues that get swept under the carpet. And and it was a wonderful thing. And young people, 80% of young people supported them. Whereas 10% of people my age supported them or less. So it's a huge kind of curve. And so I think the hope is that kind of politics, green, peace-oriented, anti-nuclear, that it is strong among students and younger people and people in high school here in Britain.
I'm glad to hear that. I've heard that it's true in the US too. I haven't been teaching for so long that I'm not in touch with young people, but it's encouraging to think that the next generation may be a little wiser than the current one. But I like your question, Nigel. The question you're posing, I think, is the one that haunts me, which is what can we use as the explanation for this upsurge, or what we want to call it a recent upsurge. We certainly, I hope, will say it's a passing thing, as Larry believes, but whether it's a passing thing or something we can only expect to grow, the question is, why is it happening now at this moment in history? I cannot account for anything that would explain a return to a sort of a primitive, localistic, tribalistic orientation rather than a global one. This is a time in world history when, more than maybe any time I can recall, we have problems that can only be solved globally by international cooperation and global thinking, global warming being the most obvious example. And the world economy had been integrating with globalization of trade and so on. So it's really hard for me to see. I mean, if we go back to the Nazi time, and I could understand sort of in retrospect why people became Nazis. You can talk about the stresses of the war and the stresses of the economy and the terms of the peace agreement and so on. It makes a certain amount of logical sense. But now I can't think of anything that really would explain whatever's gone on in the last 10 years or 15.
I have to beg to differ there. I'm sure that Larry will maybe comment on the United States, but there are people living in the direst poverty.
Would you talk closer to the mic, please?
Sorry. I have to disagree better because, there are every reasons to become a fascist or a Nazi. I mean, if you think that it was justified, for 30% of the population of Germany in 1928 to go in that direction, then, you could say the same for the people living in back-to-backs and awful housing in Britain. Most of them are people of color, immigrants or grandchildren of immigrants in dire conditions, with disproportionate infant mortality rates, the real term income going down by 10% in the last 10 years, more and more people going to food banks because they can't afford to go to the supermarket. The reason why people began to actually consider a more radical socialist program again was because they just saw the queues outside the food banks. But a very interesting thing is that one of the progressive forces in this country, do you know where it's coming from at the moment?
No.
Young black soccer players.
Really?
Well, no, be serious, because these people have gone out to campaign against racism, to take the knee before games, even though the government said it was ridiculous. They called it gesture politics, attacked them for doing it. They have supported child poverty programs, and they got the government, because these young black players are so good and so popular, the government had to backtrack twice on its child poverty programs because of the campaign of these young black sports people who become real heroes, with murals of their faces on the walls of city streets, in the poor end of town. So that's an alternative to fascism. These people, are talking about slavery is not just something happened to their great-grandfather in the Caribbean, or, but something that's real for them, and links them directly with the civil rights movement, which remains, one has to say, immensely relevant and significant. It was the greatest, bravest movement in American history, in my view. That Selma and all that, and the Freedom Summers, and John Lewis, and thank God he got a little bit of respect when he died, and so he should. That was a heroic period. And I feel very fortunate to have been around as a student and, be however tiny a part to play a little bit on the pickets and sit-ins and so on. It was Hail America. That's the America. What was it? That wonderful poet, the wonderful black poet, said, America is not America to me. In other words, there is that American dream, and that's perhaps it carried forward. Pete Seeger and all those people who talked to us about it, sung about it over the years. But that's where we can build it. It's a good social movement, as a peace movement's been, a civil rights movement's been, and I think that's where we have to build, so that there is an alternative to the Tea Parties and the racists and
yeah. If I could add here, the question of why do we see at this time when we need global solutions to global problems, do we see nationalist movements flourish, which seem to move in the wrong direction? That's a good question. I want to take a little time to deal with that. Those global problems didn't seem as severe 7 years ago or 6 years ago. What did seem significance, as Nigel points out, to some people was that economies were stagnating, that the rich were getting much richer, and the workers were not advancing. Indeed, we're losing ground. We're becoming poorer and poorer. And at the same time, there was economic stagnation for the working classes. There was also a mass wave of migration from the global South, coming to Britain and to France and to Italy and to the United States and so on. And therefore, the right wing, rather than saying, well, in this condition of growing economic inequality, we should tax the rich, and we should redistribute wealth, and we should support social services, said the reason you workers are having problems now is because of those foreigners, especially those people of color who are pouring into our countries and undermining our glorious nations. And that was the UKIP theme. That was the Trump theme. That was the Salvini theme. That was the Le Pen theme, and
the Brexit theme.
So on, and therefore, like right-wing movements of the past, including Hitler's, they made substantial political gains on that basis. However, and here's where I think some of the change has come from more recently. There's also been a growing resistance to that that kind of scapegoating and nationalist program because of two factors. One is that a lot of people got a whiff of fascism. That is, a lot of people were extremely worried about how redolent these new nationalist movements were of the bad old days of Nazism and fascism in Italy and other fascist movements around the world. And therefore, they began to rally around any politician who could defeat the nationalist candidate. And that happened recently in France, and it happened in the United States too, where Biden, who is certainly a centrist candidate who didn't inspire Bernie Sanders supporters like me, for example, and so on. When Biden was running, we were happy to vote for Biden when the alternative was Donald Trump and the Republican Party. So there was a rallying, just as there had been during the 1930s, a kind of popular front against fascism and so on. So that was one reason for the recent shift, I think. And a second reason is, as you point out, Meta, that these problems are so obviously global problems that have swept over the world in the last few years, like the pandemic and the climate crisis and the nuclear arms race, the revival of that, and so on, not to mention global poverty and misery, that the nationalist parties have no answer really to that, except this false answer of building higher walls and keeping out foreigners and subordinating minority groups, oppressing them, and so on. So there's been growing resistance to that right wing, and I think that's having some effect now.
Mm. No, I have to say, I don't think that the explanation is really economic, because I did some close scrutiny of the exit polls after the November election. And it really, the correlations with support for Biden or Trump didn't have much to do with either income or education or occupation, except at the very, very high extreme levels. When you get to postgraduate level jobs, professional jobs, people earning over 100,000 a year, then you could see significant, like 10 percentage points increase of support for Biden, which even that's not great. I mean, not extraordinary, but the rest of it, it was almost even throughout. So the notion that this,
except on race and ethnicity.
Race, exactly. That's exactly where it is. It was really about race. It's white supremacy, and some of the current, more recent studies. There's a guy, Pace. I'm not sure what his name is. I think it's Chicago, who has been studying the support for the insurrection of January the 6th. And other studies similar. My friend Arlie, maybe Nigel remembers Arlie Hochschild. She was in our cohort.
I'm in touch with her still, actually. Yeah.
In graduate school, and she's studying neo-Nazis in Kentucky or someplace, and she all of these things point to the primary concern. If you ask people why they're supporting the insurrection, say, or why they supported the Charlottesville or Charlottetown, marches of neo-Nazis a few years ago, it had to do with the sense of being displaced as a white people who are losing their position, their status in society as compared to their economic condition. So I think it's really about pride and dignity and comparative relative status compared to other people, especially immigrants or people making claims on society for special treatment. For example, even gay people or disabled people or women and other people wanting a particularistic considerations made for their benefit. There's a lot of resentment about that. But why is it happening now? Because it's not just the U.S. It's happening in Brazil, as you pointed out. It's happening in India, as you pointed out. It's happening in the Philippines. I mean, there are all kinds of places where this kind of resentment about declining status is apparently extremely salient to people, extremely important to people. Why now? I don't get it. I really don't understand why this particular historical moment would be one in which a person's ethnic group's status should be so important to them.
I think I disagree a little bit, Meta, but that's partly because I think the experience in Europe is different. Because I think that here the status thing and economic threat go together. And it reminds me of poor whites in the South, the whole business of relative deprivation. White people in depressed and deprived areas, and there are very large ones in the north and Midlands of England, where really the life standards are very poor for whites as well. There is a resentment against immigrants, third generation Asian, third generation fourth generation Caribbean, and this is played on by the right, and far from the centre of British politics attacking that for what it is, proto-fascism in some cases, they've gone along with it. And so, they play hardball on migration. They criticize taking the knee. They do very little for the deprived areas in the north except promises. But nevertheless, those deprived people, which is a status thing as well, I agree, identity thing, they become little Englanders. They vote against Brexit. They vote against Europe because they see it as a source of more migration and more socialism or social equality. And they think, well, that means that, I have to compete with a skilled engineer from Poland, for a job. But there is some truth in that, but it was totally exaggerated by Farage and the Leave campaign, which Boris Johnson played a key role, of course. And we remain having a Brexit nationalist government which appeals to some pretty nasty sentiments. It's a very nasty government. And I think that probably people in the US, having had a dose of Trump, don't realise just how serious the British version is and how corrupt it is. how it's continuing to line the pockets of the people that Larry was talking about, the corporations, not taxing them, and is still basically supporting the lifestyles of a much richer portion of the country in the southeast around London, which is seen by everybody. What's going to happen, I don't know, but it's a very fluid situation. But as I say, thank goodness that that grassroots movement of young people, which is not channeled into any party. Well, it was briefly channeled into support, but the Labour Party suddenly gained 250,000 more members, and most of them young people. I'm afraid most of them have become disillusioned with the new Labour leader, who's playing the nationalist card also, buy British, waving the flag. We got, and very anti-Scottish nationalism. So, the Labour Party has gone for the same area of politics. I mean, trying to appeal to that nationalist, little England, anti-immigrant, and that's very, very worrying.
Right. And again, this is not really a shift from the classic policies of the right wing throughout the past century. If one looks historically at things, one of the things the left had done, starting during the 19th century, was to press for the vote, the expansion of the suffrage. If the masses had the vote, they could redistribute the wealth. Of course, another alternative was revolution, but the vote was appealing too, on just that basis, that would bring social progress, economic and social equality. And Labour Party, Socialist parties supported that. And the right fought against that expansion of the vote and ultimately lost, although the loss was gradual. So that the masses had the vote, generally speaking, by the 20th century in many democratic countries. And how could the right deal with that situation? That would mean redistribution of wealth, redistribution of property. And that was something the left and reform groups were calling for. Well, how do you counter that? You counter that by saying, no, it's not the wealthy, it's not the old nobility, it's not the manufacturers and so on that are your problems, that have the wealth. It's the Jews, it's the foreigners, it's and so on and so on. And that became the theme song of the Tsar's government and of fascist movements. And in the United States, the counterpart was keep down blacks and Mexicans and others and so on. They're causing the problems. All these Eastern Europeans coming into the United States, we have to restrict them and so on. That's your problem, not the maldistribution of income and wealth. And that's the old game being played out again today by these right-wing nationalist movements.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, though, if anybody's looked at polls and other things with respect to some of the effects of the pandemic. This pandemic, everybody says, well, it's going to change the world. Everything's going to be different afterward. But I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure what changes one should expect, or even why one should expect them. I would imagine that, if anything, the fact that these germs don't respect borders, and that it's a pandemic, meaning worldwide, and you can't keep it out by strengthening your border guards or putting up walls. That this would yield a greater insight that the world, humankind, is really global in scope, and that we have to politically think globally too. But if anything, it may have had the opposite effect, that nations have put up borders that, I mean, the U.S. and Canada, you can't go from one to the other, and you couldn't travel around Europe, and so on. And it's as if all of the nations were looking out for number one in terms of vaccinating their own population before thinking of sharing their vaccines with other countries. This may have actually exacerbated the problem, but I don't know. Has anybody been looking at that in a systematic way, in terms of political sociology?
I don't know. I haven't heard anyone doing it, but I think just as a
Get a little closer to the mic.
well, I think I don't know if anybody's doing an academic analysis of it, but just as a sort of a layperson, I would say that the media have played an enormous role in all these things, on pandemic, on global crisis, as painting it as a national issue. It's our vaccine. It's Oxford's vaccine, even though it's made in, I don't know, Holland, and although it was an international effort, particularly through the European Union, it was painted as a national thing, and that we were going to have ours first, and then if there's anybody left a few people in Africa can have it. It's been dreadful, and the World Health Organization was attacked from the word go. I mean, before it even came to Britain, they were attacking the WHO for exaggerating it, and all then blaming the Chinese and saying it's all their fault and conspiracy theories.
Mm-hmm.
But the majority of press here are nationalist. They present things in purely national terms. They don't argue internationally, except one or two papers. The Guardian is an honourable exception most of the time, and Channel 4 News, and one or two little. A lot of people watch Al Jazeera, for example, to get another take on all this. But generally, everything that people get in the supermarket is national. Nationalist, national framing the pandemic, national framing the global crisis. Oh, well, we can't do that. We've got to have our new drilling in Scotland. Oh, no, we can't do that. Because if we don't do it, then the Chinese will do it. And so on, playing off one state against the other on the pandemic, on the vaccinations, on drilling, on all those issues. And that's the whole point, I think, of a cooperative grouping of states like the European Union, was to try and get a little beyond that. Yes, the borders were broken down. There was a collective policy. And then, of course, the British or English papers had a field day because they say, oh, look what Europe, they made a mess of their vaccination program. Well, part of the mess was created by Britain hogging, information and distribution of vaccines. So this has become, instead of a international cooperation, which could have been, I really admire much that the WHO did, instead of, and some very brave people in Oxford who insisted that free vaccines be available for the developing world, and did it free. But there are those honourable exceptions, but generally, and I think we underestimate the power of national media in every country, whether it's, certainly we know all about Fox and Murdoch in America, but it's the same everywhere. Modi has only just began to get a bad press. Bolsonaro only just began to get a really bad press, particularly because of the pandemic. So it's irksome not to see the power that the United Nations and its other bodies had even 20, 30 years ago. And I have to say that its power has been eroded, particularly by the United States, I think. Not even before Trump. I don't know if Larry would agree with me, but it strikes me that, in a sense, the United States created the UN, and now sort of at times its worst enemy. The Paris Accords as well and everything, but at least we're back in that.
Now,
so I'm in that position because I have two passports. I'm both British and American, or European and American, I prefer to say. It's very interesting because in that sense, I've got out a little bit, just put in my personal life, a bit outside my national frame, as it were, whichever it is. I don't know what it will be actually.
Mm-hmm. Larry, do you agree?
Well, I think that. All right, I missed the last part of what Nigel was saying, thanks to the sound.
I know, because of the sound. Well, let me, I had a conversation yesterday with a friend in Moscow about public opinion and political opinion in Moscow. And there are several, you have to infer things in a funny way, because their logic is not what not straightforward. It's not the way you would think they would imagine things. They are very suspicious of the government. They don't believe a word the government tells them. And yet they want to keep Putin. And that's true, he says, of the young people too. So young people in Britain, you can take heart from these, progressive young people. And maybe I understand that's true in the US too, I don't know. But certainly that apparently is not the case in Russia now. People have massively rejected vaccination. And when they're asked why they don't want to get vaccines, they say, because the government is promoting it. And whatever the government promotes, you better do better to take care of yourself by just staying away from it. If they don't force you to take a vaccination, don't do it. You're better off without it. And yet they will support the continuation of Putin's presidency indefinitely because they're afraid of some kind of instability or change. They're really worried that there might be some kind of revolution, and that is apparently part of the motivation. But so, attitude about Brexit, or not Brexit, I mean vaccinations, COVID, it isn't a straightforward political effect. It isn't that because they believe the government has done a terrible job and they don't trust the vaccines that the government has produced, therefore they will vote against the government. No, they don't trust the government, but they'll support the government anyway in most cases. So this is weird to me, but so at any rate, that's his interpretation, and it fits other things that I've heard about Russia as well. I can't begin to explain the attitude people have in India toward Modi, especially since there's been the catastrophic mismanagement of the vaccination program against the Delta virus, and they have this terrific outburst of disease a few months ago. I don't understand India's political psychology whatsoever.
Well, just to tack on to that, they're doing lawn mowing outside, by the way, so my sound quality may be rather odd at this point. We shouldn't assume human rationality always prevails, or that rationality is the major force that motivates human beings. Clearly a variety of crises, certainly the disease pandemic, would seem logically, given their global bases, to lead to a global solution, and to subordinating nationalism, and to turning to the World Health Organization, and to at least the authorities, the scientists who deal with the subject, and accept the vaccine and move forward with public health measures. But unfortunately, there's enough irrationality in human nature, or at least in some people. At the same time, there are forces in these societies that play on that kind of irrationality, just as they play on racism and religious prejudices and national prejudices and so on. So that even though it makes sense to use the vaccine to stop the pandemic and distribute it around the world, the reality is that doesn't always happen. And so, as H.G. Wells once said about nuclear weapons, the future is a race between education and catastrophe. That is, people need to lose their ignorance and accept reason and knowledge and move forward with the lives of people around the world. And unfortunately, not all people are ready for that or are willing to do that, and they're often blinded by the prejudices that are pushed on them as an alternative to accepting reason.
Are you in touch with students much, Larry? Because I haven't met a student in years.
Oh, well,
And I wonder whether you have an impression, or from your colleagues, about the public opinion, political opinions of the university age cohort.
Well, I've been retired for the last 10 years, but occasionally I do meet students in other gatherings. And I must say they're often more internationally minded than older people are. And indeed, so many things in the modern world are international. Entertainment, communications, products of every kind. It would be hard to find a household in the United States or other supposedly advanced industrial civilizations that don't have products that are made in foreign countries. So I think younger people are often more accepting of things and ideas and connections with other countries. And I think that was true in the European Union as well. Young people traveled and they met people in other lands. They weren't that different from themselves, while older people rooted often in smaller cities and towns with less money to afford them the opportunity to travel, didn't have that opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think
well,
that's right.
I hope that is true everywhere, but I know my impression is from yesterday that it's not true in Russia, and I really don't know about other countries. For example, did somebody say that Bolsonaro is losing steam now? Because seriously, okay.
Yeah, there's
Right.
a call for him to be.
Whole show. Sorry, Nigel. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh,
go ahead.
I mean, not only have his favorite candidates lost elections recently, but furthermore, the polls show that he's losing to Lula, the social democratic candidate there, who'll be running against him by more than 2-1 in the polls. So it isn't even close at this point. And portions of the right wing have even turned on Bolsonaro. He's gone too far for them as well. So I think
calling
he's
to
on
indict
the
him, aren't they? In fact, yes. I think there's a call to indict Bolsonaro.
Yes.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, good. All right.
Just
Well,
say a word about international institutions, because there is still a peace studies department at Bradford University, and I employ some of their students, mostly grad students, to just help me on various projects, and they come from all over the world. Partly it was through the Erasmus program, but in other ways. So my last assistant here was Finnish. Before that was a German. Oh goodness, well after that, French. So we had the whole European Union here in my study, helping out on things. And yes, I mean that obviously an exceptional group of students, and not typical in many ways. But just looking around, I think the polls of Britain show it, is that that's the most enlightened in terms of post-national, to use that word, opinion, and that the huge variation across the age range in many European countries, actually from the sort of relatively liberal, well, certainly liberal views of the 18-year-olds up to the pretty dire views of the people in their 70s and 80s is extraordinary. I mean, there is just a straight line. It's not a curve, it's a line. And that appears on so many issues: international aid, gender politics, just everything, racism particularly. So, that is, yes, encouraging. But how do you harness that politically? That's the big question. Mm-hmm. Corbyn came near, and that's why the Conservatives and the Nationalists ran scared. Boris Johnson did an interview recently where he said, it wasn't Boris, it was his big advisor, Cummings, who said, we supported Boris Johnson because he was the only person we were sure could beat Corbyn. Otherwise, we thought he was the most useless prime minister Britain's ever had. But we had to stop Corbyn. So they were really scared. And of course, in that first election, he did well. I mean, the vote went up significantly, and it was only a huge press campaign against the Labour Party as being socialist. As was to some extent, of course, against Bernie as well, but that did it. And of course, Bernie got a lot of younger support too. So, there is that. But anyway, since I think we're coming to the end of our time soon, yes. I wanted to do a little plug for an international event, which is universal, and I think it would be one that's dear to Larry's heart, because our little peace groups around the country that still survive here celebrate August the 6th, Hiroshima Day. And they will again this year in the local village square, where there will be a distance masked vigil to remember Hiroshima. And I think those kind of events are important, and it can be made a beautiful, memorable occasion. Some people float lanterns. On the cover of my book, I've got the lantern floating festival on the. Can you show it? Oh yeah, great.
Yes,
Thank you.
There it is.
Plug. Buy a copy today. It's a lovely picture.
Absolutely.
And anyway, so, August the 6th, that's something that can bring us together around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Poor old Japanese having a bad time with the Olympic Games at the moment. So, let's remember, that they suffered, but it was a marker when nuclear weapons were used, and the idea that will never be used.
Absolutely. And you're right. The Hiroshima Day is a very important thing in Toronto as well. Although, again, because of the pandemic, it's not going to be the normal kind of ceremony. I guess everybody's still having to retreat back to our masks a little bit, as long as this new upsurge.
Well, we're still encouraging people. We've got a poster on our door saying, please vigil on 11 o'clock on 6th of August in the square at Grassington. And all 50 members of our local peace group will hopefully be there, as long as they don't keep dying off.
Larry, how about there in Albany? Is there anything going about Hiroshima Day?
Oh, absolutely. There'll be a reading of John Hersey's book, Hiroshima. And there are activities all over New York State and all over the nation commemorating the atomic bombing. On this point, I should add that forgetting political parties for the minute and looking at the realm of social movements, there are globalist social movements, and certainly one is the peace movement. And the nuclear disarmament movement, that's part of that. But there's also a worldwide women's rights movement, and there's a worldwide environmentalist movement, and there's a worldwide labor movement. And these, it seems to me, are significant forces that are fighting a global struggle for social justice and peace. And they provide the basis for a new world and a global system that will move beyond the national divisions of the past.
Yeah,
indeed. And we old folks are still kicking and still trying, but both of you are, I cherish you as allies in this continuing struggle as we seem to move forward to a new era. Thank you both. It's been a very enlightening and sentimental conversation for me.
Thank you, Matt.